Okay, recording.
Okay.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. First, as is our tradition, I would like to pay respect to the traditional custodians of this land, the Kulin Nation of the Ngunnawal people. We pay our respect to elders, both past, present, and emerging, and extend our respect, especially to any Indigenous peoples who may be with us here today. Thank you for coming. So it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dafydd. Dafydd did his PhD at the University of London, and since then has been very prolific in writing on Taiwan studies and doing much more than writing on Taiwan studies. But the writing is very impressive. 4 monographs, all related to Taiwan politics, and then an amazing collection of edited volumes related to migration, to Indigenous peoples, and to Taiwan studies in general, and a steady stream of articles, book chapters. For us in the Australasian Taiwan Studies Association, which is hosting this event, perhaps very important is that Dafydd is the director of the Taiwan Studies program at SOAS, which is just a fantastic program that's been producing loads of graduate students ready to be the next generation of Taiwan studies. So very central. Dafydd is also involved in establishing the European Association of Taiwan Studies, which is much larger than our Australasian Association, although we're growing. So today's book is titled Taiwan's Green Parties, Alternative Politics in Taiwan. It was just published recently with Routledge. And shall I pass it on to you, Dafydd? Lennon, did you have anything to say, or are you going to speak after?
No, I'll probably introduce Mei-fen as well. So today, we're honored to have Dafydd to talk about his book on green parties, and also we have a Professor Guo Mei-fen as a discussant. And Mei-fen is a lecturer at Macquarie University, expert in Chinese diaspora in Australia, as well as she has also done quite a bit of research on KMT and green parties in Taiwan. So she's definitely the best person to comment or be a discussant on this topic. So I don't have more to say. As Craig said, this is a new association. We're growing. We're welcoming more members to join us, and we will have a series of activities lining up this year and next year, including a Taiwan Forum and Film Festival in May next year. So if you're interested in getting information from us or becoming a member, just get in touch with us. You'll probably be able to find emails from Eventbrite. We'll have the association emails there. All right. So I'll pass the microphone to Dafydd. You are muted.
Yeah, many thanks for that introduction, and it's very special to be part of this Australasian Taiwan Studies Association. So what I'm going to do today then is talk a little bit about this new book, and I'll try not to talk too long, just to make sure we have enough time for discussion and questions. So the book itself, Taiwan's Green Parties, was published in March of this year, but it was a long kind of process to actually get to publishing the book. The research itself started in late 2012. And what I try and do in the book is tell the story of Taiwan ecological parties since the mid-1990s. So I'm trying to tell the history of Taiwan's both party system and civil society through this project, but from quite a different angle from studies on purely social movements or studies that focus purely on Taiwan's party politics. So in today's session, I'm going to talk a little bit about both the personal and academic reasons why I ended up writing a book on Taiwan's green parties. I'll talk about the research questions that drive the project, and I'll talk about some of the stories that feature in the book and how I use these stories to address those kind of key research questions. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about what I've been doing and what I plan to do since the book has been published. And then hopefully we should have lots of time for discussion. So my interest in Taiwan's political parties originates from my early visits to Taiwan, first as a language student in 1989, 1990, and then working in Taiwan for much of the 1990s. So that meant that I was a kind of an eyewitness to Taiwan's first decade or so of multi-party politics. Now, of course, the key actors in that story are the Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang, the KMT. But what was quite interesting about some of those early elections was that movement parties did try to contest those early elections, particularly leftist parties. So I had some awareness and some interest in Taiwan's small parties right from the start of my early times in Taiwan. And when it came to actually writing my first book on Taiwan, which was coming out of my PhD, I chose to focus on the most important three political parties in that first decade of multi-party politics: the KMT, the DVP, and the New Party, which today seems like a irrelevant topic. But at the time in the 1990s, it was a very vibrant political party, particularly in the mid-1990s. But one of the things that troubled me about the New Party was that some of the frameworks that I used to analyze the mainstream political parties didn't seem to work so well for the New Party. So after I finished that first book, I decided to do a little bit of research on Taiwan's small parties. So I published a couple of pieces that tried to explain the evolution of these challenger parties. And that first article came out in 2005 called New Parties in Taiwan. And I had a couple of very short paragraphs that looked at the Green Party Taiwan. But it's hard to imagine that I would actually end up spending so much time on a topic that I only managed to put in a couple of paragraphs. So the turning point that actually pushed me to turn this into a big book project was one of my students in SOAS, University of London, UARU, who was doing a food anthropology master at my university in 2011 to 2012. And just a couple of weeks after submitting her MA dissertation, she went on to stand for election in Taiwan for the Green Party. So for me, that was really fascinating that someone could join an election with almost minimal preparation. And having studied mainstream parties, I knew how long it takes to be a serious candidate. So for me, that was that kind of increased my interest in the topic. Later on, you went on to become the co-convener of the Green Party. And she sent me an email in the autumn of 2012 asking if I'd be interested in sharing the news about an Australian Green Party research fund, and whether any of my students would be interested in applying for this. Rather than sharing this funding news, I decided to bid for it myself, together with a Taiwanese academic, Peng Yanwen. And we set up a project, a proposal to look at the history of the Taiwan Green Party and how it could actually improve its electoral performance. We weren't actually successful at getting that Australian Green Party funding, but by that stage, we thought this was a really interesting project. And we decided to go ahead and organize some focus groups that looked at the recent history of the Green Party and also the more kind of long-term history of the Green Party. And we held these two focus groups in December of 2012. And I just was so addicted after I joined these focus groups, because the kind of people that were involved, their kind of way of thinking was just so different from the mainstream party politicians that I've been so used to working with in my earlier publications. So that was the start of what became a book project. But of course, in addition to these kind of personal reasons for getting involved in this book project, we of course need to have some academic justifications. I think this is one of the challenges that we have in Taiwan studies. How do we actually make our research interesting beyond the Taiwan studies field? How do we kind of engage with different literatures? And this is something that I try and do in, I think, a lot of my work. But in this book in particular, I'm trying to engage with theories and frameworks about small political parties and movement parties. So I'm hoping that this book will be of interest to social movement party, and also small party scholars. Another literature that this book tries to engage with is the pretty significant literature on global green parties. And one of the ways that I've tried to make this linkage is a couple of months ago, we organized a session about writing books on green parties, where we got scholars that worked on the Japanese, Canadian, and German green parties, together with me to talk about my experience of Taiwan. And lastly, I think this book engages with a lot of the literature in Taiwan on party politics and sociology, particularly the Taiwanese literature on social movements. I think so far, I found greater interest among Taiwanese sociologists than political scientists in this project. Furthermore, I think there's some things that are specific about the Taiwan Green Party that make it a really fascinating case study. In many ways, despite the limited electoral success of the party, it seems to me that the party has been ahead of its time in many areas. For example, it's the first party to have a female party leader, the first party to have an openly gay party leader. It's also the first party to have nominated openly gay candidates as early as 2010, and to have significant numbers of openly LGBT candidates. We also see it being a pioneer when it comes to issue advocacy. Often it's willing to advocate issues that other parties are not willing to touch. For example, the death penalty, legalizing same-sex marriage, way ahead of the mainstream parties. I think another thing that makes this party really interesting is its international engagement. other political parties in Taiwan are members of these global party families. But I would say that the level and quality of engagement of the Taiwanese Greens is much greater than those of other mainstream parties. And lastly, even though the party itself is not always at the forefront of some of these key social movements, many of its leaders have played key roles. For example, in feminist groups such as Awakening, in the anti-nuclear movement, but also in the global Greens movement. So for example, one of the party members goes on to be the convener of the Asia Pacific Greens Network, and then goes on to be the convener of the Global Greens Network. So we have a Taiwanese party member becoming the head of the Global Green Parties Network. Okay, now let me then just go on to talk briefly about the research questions that that feature in the book. And I divide them into how, who, so what, and why questions. The how question looks at how the party has changed over its 25-year history, particularly in terms of its changing organizational structure and issue advocacy. The who looks at questions of who's led the party, who's represented the party, and who's supported the party over the years. The so what looks at the impact, particularly in terms of electoral results and international engagement. The why question looks at how we explain party formation, how we explain party change, and probably the why question I devote the most space to is how to explain the party's electoral performance. So to a certain extent, many of these issues are core questions that feature in the political parties and small parties literature. So again, I can engage with those literatures using Taiwan as my case study. Now, when it comes to actually explaining the electoral performance of the party, I used a hybrid framework that incorporates both party system factors. So in other words, the strategies and approaches of the mainstream parties, but I also bring in the impact of some of the competing smaller parties. And the other element of my framework looks at the party's ability to balance both party ideals and vote maximizing. So I devote a lot of attention to the quality of the campaigns. What did it get right? What did it get wrong? And one of the key arguments in the book is that failure was never inevitable. If different strategies or alliance approaches had been taken, the party's performance should have been better. And the picture that I've got on this slide, I think, is a really good illustration of how failure was never inevitable. So this is a poster from the party's 2014 campaign. And we can see a series of popular alternative culture figures, social movement activists who have come out to endorse the party in November of 2014. But if we move a year ahead in time, we can see that the vast majority of these figures are no longer supporting the party. So we can see how the party often hasn't been able to hold on to its support base, as some have switched their support to mainstream parties or to other rival social movement parties. Now, to a certain extent, I view this book as my second PhD book. My second book was more of a textbook, but this book was a real kind of research monograph. And I think the similarities and differences between this and my first book. Some of the questions that I look at are similar in terms of measuring and explaining party change, but I put in more questions this time. And I'm pretty sure that if I had to defend this as in a PhD viva, I think I would have had quite a lot of problems. I'm sure I would have been told to make some significant changes. Another difference is that I look at a longer time period, 25 years versus 10 years. Some of the research methods had similarities and differences. For example, I used a lot of interviews for this book, but the difference was that I was interviewing the same people multiple times over 8 years. And I also added other methods such as focus groups, member and supporter interviews. I also use election advertising as a key resource, but I used a much more diverse range of propaganda sources. And lastly, I've been much more active in promoting the book this time compared to my first book, where I didn't even have any kind of book launch for that first book. So the next couple of slides give some sense of some of the methods that I was using. For example, my early focus groups. On the right, we have an example of a 2016 TV election ad that went into the analysis. The rise of internet campaigning also meant that there were a lot more diverse potential sources. For example, blogs. On the left, we have a poster that was on a candidate blog from, I think, the 2010 local elections. And if you look carefully, you can see an endorsement from a leader of the Australian Greens, Bob Brown, for this Taiwanese candidate. And on the right, we have another really fantastic source for political analysis. That's the election gazettes, the 选举公报, where we have information on the candidate background, their experience, education, and also their policy proposals. And this also allowed me to use the same set of data for multiple elections. Okay, so what I'm going to do now in the next few slides is then just talk through some of the things that I covered in the various chapters in the book. And I'll touch upon how I addressed some of those key research questions. So one of my favorite chapters in the book is chapter 3, which I call Beautiful Accidents, because this was how one of the respondents described the formation of the party in January 1996, when Taiwan is in the midst of its first direct presidential election, but also in the midst of the cross-strait missile crisis of 1995 to 1996. And I think this chapter also gives a sense of why I call the book Taiwan's Green Parties, because I don't just look purely at the Green Party Taiwan. I also look at a number of other political parties, such as the Splinter Trees Party, as well as a failed attempt to create a Green Party in the summer of 1995. I also talk about the Green Party Social Democratic Alliance, but I don't really talk about that in this chapter. I talk about it more in the 2016 chapter. But this chapter allows me to engage with the broader literature on why we see party formation. Why did the party form? And does the patterns that we see in the Taiwan case match those of other Green parties, for example, in Europe? While in contrast, the Trees Party case allows me to engage with the literature on party splitting. What causes politicians to jump ship and change political parties? So this chapter, I think, is one that in places is full of hope, because we see the party setting out on a journey. But it's also a little bit tragic, because we hear the story of how the party splits. And one of the features of this book is we hear a lot about arguments, a lot of bitter arguments. And I think Green parties, both in Taiwan, but I think also internationally, often struggle to deal with different points of view. I think this is, again, something that comes through a lot in the book. Chapter 4 looks at the so what question. So I try to measure the impact of the party in a number of ways. For example, through election results. So I set out the broad trends of election results, but I also look at the election results at the district level. So, for example, the one time that the party has actually won a seat in a national parliament comes in 1996 in Yunlin County, and that's the figure Gao Mengding, who we see in the picture on the left. And the other so what element that I address is the international engagement. And I look at the way that the Green Party reaches out to international Green parties, and then goes on to be involved as a founding member of both the Asia Pacific Greens and also the Global Greens network. And we see this within the first couple of months of the party's history. So the picture that we have on the right here is the visit of the England and Wales Green Party figure, Penny Kemp, who comes to Taiwan for that first campaign to show solidarity, but she also leaves a big imprint on many of those party founders, talking to them about what it means to be a Green party. And she also helped set up connections between the Taiwan Green Party and European Green parties in those first few years of the party's history. And for me, one of the most moving elements of this project was finally actually connecting with Penny Kemp in the last couple of months of her life and helping to set up a reunion with some of the party founders before she passed away this summer. And another thing that comes out from this chapter is that there's often not a correlation between the party's electoral performance and the party's international engagement. At times, the party is actually more successful internationally than it is in terms of elections within Taiwan itself. Okay, in chapter 5, I look at the who question. In other words, who are the Green parties? What kind of people have led the party? What kind of people have been candidates? And also what kind of people have been supporters? In some of my reflections since the book has come out, I think that I probably have neglected the support side of the party. I've focused a lot more on the party leaders, party activist side. I think this picture here from a press conference in 1998 gives us a sense of the nature of the party. On the far right, we have a party candidate, Chen Guangyu, who was the first female leader of the party, and one of this kind of younger generation of party activists. Next, we have Gao Changyan, who is one of the party founders and one of the figures that's featured throughout the book. He's a former blacklisted activist who was not able to return to Taiwan during the late martial law period as a result of his activism in the United States. He then becomes a professor and a leading figure in Taiwan's Environmental Protection Union. And someone who's really willing to confront the KMT to gain media attention. We have a European Green Party visitor, and also we have Linda Origa, who I think many of those in Taiwan studies will be aware of, who also plays an important role in the party's international engagement. She was the party's international officer for the first few years of the party's history, as well as serving on its central executive committee. So it gives you a sense of the very different nature of the party leadership, with the social movement links, with a much greater gender balance, but also the international side of the party. Okay, then what I do in the next set of chapters, and the core set of empirical chapters in the book, is to address a couple of those key questions through looking at election case studies. So particularly looking at the how question, in other words, how is the party campaigned, and how we explain the party's performance. So the party is established in January of 1996, and it has its first election less than 2 months later in March of 1996. And the party actually does pretty well. I think it gets something like 1.5% of the national vote, despite only having, I think, about candidates in about 10 districts. So why does it do so well? And also, why do we see variation in terms of why do some candidates do very well? For example, Gao Mengding, we saw on the earlier slide. And why do some candidates do less well? So I do a mixture of looking at the overall campaign, and Gao Chongyan was a key figure in the overall campaign, gaining that critical media attention. So here we have one example in these pictures here. So we have in the background, we have the cross-strait missile crisis of 95, 96. So to show that the Green Party is tough on China, Gao goes out on a fishing boat into that Chinese missile test zone. And this not only gains Taiwanese press attention, but it also gains international press attention. So for example, the European Green Parties become aware of the Taiwan Green Party, partly a result of some of these international media reports. This case of Gao Chongyan going to catch missiles will again feature in the political advertising for the party 24 years later in the most recent election in 2020. Okay, next we move on to the next round of elections in 1998, where we have both local and national elections. But here, one of the puzzles that I really focus on is, why does the party seem to almost decline? In other words, it looked like it had a chance to have a real breakthrough in 1996. But 2 years later, the party's candidates do pretty poorly. And one of the big puzzles that I try to address is what explains what's the overall decline in the party's performance, and why was one campaign particularly successful? And that was a campaign of Peng Yanwen, who goes on to work with me on the early stage of this project. And there are a number of things that were quite special about this candidacy of Peng Yanwen in Taipei City Council that almost is successful in getting elected. So I look at elements such as her campaign team, some of her campaign strategies, such as campaigning on bicycles, including her face on the campaign flags, but also the way that she's able to gain mainstream media attention as a result of one of her campaign events, where she and her team go to the KMT campaign headquarters of Maizhou, and there's a confrontation, but that confrontation allows them to get that critical mainstream media attention. The next chapter, chapter 8, is a little bit different because the focus is no longer on elections, because the party, for a period of time, seems to drop out of elections. But this is a common pattern for many of Taiwan's small parties, to join elections, face defeat, and then disappear electorally. Instead, I focus more on trying to explain, why does the party seem to collapse after 1998? And how does the party rebuild itself in 2005, 2006? And I look at some of the strategies that Peng uses to rebuild and recreate the party in terms of creating a new set of party activists. And this allows the party to return to elections in 2006. And what I look at in this chapter, chapter 9, is a number of election case studies. And what we find, though, is that the overall environment is very, very different. Despite having reasonably good funding, much more experienced candidates, the party really struggles to make a breakthrough. And again, I look at a number of case studies. For example, in the picture on the right, we have I think it was a 24-hour treetop protest by one of the party's by-election candidates, which gains a lot of media attention. But the actual election results were very, very poor in that by-election. So again, I look at some of the problems with the party's internal organization, its nomination, and its relationship with potential ally parties. So for example, in this case, originally the DPP was willing to drop out of this election and let the Green Party stand against the KMT. But what went wrong in those negotiations that made the DPP change its mind and go back on its promise? In chapter 10, then, I look at the party's attempt to kind of build on that return to elections and to learn from those initial setbacks from 2006 to 2008, and how the party tries to go through organizational reforms to try and make it a more competitive actor. And here I look at a mixture of both local elections in 2010 and the national elections in 2012. And it's only in these national elections in 2012 that the party is able to more or less get back to the level that it had in its first elections in 1996. It gets, I think, 1.7% of the vote. The local elections, I think, are also really interesting because, again, it's getting closer to the kind of level that it had in the local elections in 1998. So, for example, we see the first LGBT candidates standing in 2010. I think it has 2 openly gay candidates. And we have the first case of a semi-alliance with the DPP in the Pan An Sheng case, which we see again in this poster here, the one that's listed as number 1. And what I do here is, again, I look at a mixture of both the well-known cases, but also some of the less well-known cases. For example, I look at Zhang Yujing's case, where she was standing in a hopeless single-member district. And I look at how she actually manages to become one of the most successful single-member district candidates with a campaign team that just consists of her 2 young daughters, one in kindergarten, one early in primary school. And the way that she was able to both gain votes for herself, but also to generate votes for the party list, which is the proportional representation, which is the key target of the party. In chapter 11, we look at another round of organizational reforms. We have another, we have a new leadership structure, an attempt to make the party more professional. This is the first chapter where I look at 2 parties. So I look at both the Green Party Taiwan, but also the Trees Party, this splinter party where the key star figure of the party splits away to create a new political party. This campaign is interesting because for the first time, the party does win local seats. So again, I look at a mixture of local successes and also less successful cases. So the party makes breakthroughs in Hsinchu and Taoyuan. but also there's disappointment. So for example, one of the most experienced candidates in the party, Wang Zhongming, who is one of the first openly gay candidates, looks like he has a great chance to win, but in the end does worse than 4 years earlier. And this Wang Zhongming's candidacy is the subject of a really fantastic documentary by Lin Qianyong called Unfinished Progress. So I borrowed the title of his documentary for this chapter, because we can see the degree of progress that the party has made, but also we can see the limitations of the Li Genzhen model of campaigning. And this is then followed up with the next round of local elections. We have the same leadership structure, but this time the party looks like it should have the breakthrough at the national level. It's working in alliance with the newly created Social Democratic Party. It's experienced, it's better funded, and at least in the early polls, it looked like it has a real chance. But the puzzle here we have is, why does the party only get 2.5% compared to 1.7% 4 years earlier? And I focused a lot on both the party system factors, for example, the rise of the New Power Party, but also the problems within the party's campaign, particularly problems in its alliance with the SDP. So in theory, this should have enhanced the party's prospects, but the way that the party handled this alliance is very, very problematic. And also the party does have an opportunity to work together with the DVP in the way that the New Power Party does. But again, it mismanages this alliance possibility. In chapter 13, we have the next round of rebuilding and reorganization. And this was the last time I actually did fieldwork in Taiwan in September of 2018 for this campaign. And this campaign was very, very different because it was perhaps the least idealistic campaign. So much more focused on winning election and much less on party advocacy. And one of the things we see here is that many traditional Green Party figures were no longer comfortable supporting the party. At times, the party is willing to work together with politicians who ideologically look quite distant from the party. So I term this winning or selling its soul. The party does win slightly more local seats compared to 2014, but still it's not really able to compete with the New Power Party as the leading movement party. And then my final empirical chapter looks at the most recent elections in 2020. We have some really interesting connections with the party's early history, with Gao Chengyan coming back to stand again for the first time in a number of years. And he does reference those catching missiles, and also the way that he tried to recall Han Kuo-yu back in 1994 in the campaign propaganda. But in reality, the focus of this campaign was on the controversial figure Wang Haoyu, who was a local councillor for the party, and the well-known media figure and psychiatrist Deng Huiwen. And here we have the puzzle of why was the party able to lose so many supporters? So many of the traditional supporters, even if they were still party members, weren't openly supporting the campaign. But it was still able to gain the same vote share and actually a higher number of votes compared to 2016. This was one of the more difficult chapters to write because I was writing the chapter during the, the election was occurring while I was writing the first draft of the book. So a lot of my interviews for this chapter were online interviews. And then finally, in the concluding chapter, I look at what happened after the election, how the party tries to rebuild after the controversial Wang Haoyu leaves the party, how the party tries to reconnect with activists who had become disillusioned with the party, how it tries to rebuild bridges with social movements. And finally, I talk a little bit about some of the practical lessons, because when I started the project, I proposed that we would come up with some strategies for how the party could improve its performance in 2012. And then 9 years later, I finally came up with some practical lessons. For example, how the party can improve its alliance structure, how the party deals with the controversial topic of relationships with the DPP and the China issue. So I think this also shows how researching a Green Party is a little bit different from mainstream parties. I think if I'm writing about mainstream parties, I'm not going to come up with practical solutions. I think it's studying a Green Party, it's much harder not to get emotionally involved, partly because of the kind of people who stand for election. I should say that today is actually the first event on my autumn tour for the book. I did something like 20 events in the first book tour, involving both media and university tour. But this, in this tour, I'm hoping to finally do some in-person talk, which I'm quite excited about after so many online events. I'm hoping to do I'm going to be doing my first talks with local Green Party branches in the UK. And I'm also hoping to start doing events in Taiwan. Originally, I planned to go to Taiwan this summer, and that will probably be delayed until next year at the earliest. And lastly, one of the things I'm particularly excited about since the book came out is I'm now working on a Chinese rewriting of the book, working together with 3 former female party leaders of the Green Party, or also academics, Peng Yewen, who features in the party's early history, Wang Yanhan, who is a leader in the 2018 period, and Rita Zhang, who was a Secretary General and candidate in the 2020 campaign. So it's not just a translation, it's an attempt to kind of bring in a range of perspectives on the party's history. As with many academic books, it's not a book that you want to be buying the hardback for, but I really encourage people to lobby your librarians to get the ebook so more people can get access to it. And I really look forward to hearing your feedback and your questions and comments, because I think that's one of the reasons why we do these kind of sessions, to kind of get different questions, get different suggestions on this research topic that's been such a life-changing experience for me. So thanks again for the invitation, and sorry I went on a little bit longer than I planned.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I certainly have questions, but before we get to questions, we have a discussant, the wonderful Mei-fen, who Lennon has already introduced, is going to, Mei-fen, have you prepared a lot? About how long do you think your talk will be? I should have asked both of you.
Very short.
Very short? Oh, take your time, take your time. We're not in a rush yet. We've still got a lot of time left, so please take your time. And then after Mei-fen has spoken, then we'll have a round of questions. Yeah. Okay, please go ahead, Mei-fen.
Okay, hello everyone from Sydney. And I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land on which I live in Sydney. And also many thanks to Dr. Zhang to invite me to join today's book seminar. I'm not an expert on Taiwan's party politics. In this case, I'm not sure I'm the right person to discuss this book. However, I show up to support the ATSA. I think it's quite important. For the very first time, we have the Taiwanese Study Association in Australia. So that's why I'm here. I'm also taking this opportunity to meet Dr. Fo and all and the new friends tonight. And as Dr. Zhang mentioned, that I had some research on KMT. However, my focus is about the early history of the Australia KMT, KMT in Australia and the South Pacific Island rather than in Taiwan. And however, I treat the Australia KMT as a social club rather than political party. So I find this quite interesting when I read Dr. Ford's book. He treats the Green Party as a political party rather than social movement organization. We can discuss more later. And right now, I'm also interested in Taiwanese community organization in Australia. So when I read Dr. Ford's book, it's quite interesting for me to see some struggle and challenge of the Green Party, which the Chinese and Taiwanese diaspora organization are also facing in Australia. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to share some of my reflection on Dr. Ford's fantastic book, and then I will ask 4 questions to discuss with Dr. Ford. And I think this book is a timing contribution to understand Taiwan's party politics, particularly in the small party after the 2016, and also the development of the Taiwanese civil society. And I think more broadly, taking the Green Party Taiwan as a case study, Dr. Ford challenged the Western concept about a political party. And I think it's quite important contribution for this book. And so, as I mentioned, Dr. Ford's book treats the Green Party 绿党 as a political party, which is a refresh idea. Why I say that? Because the previous study, like Taiwanese scholar, Professor He Mingxiu, he did not regard the Green Party as a political party in Taiwan. And the reason the Professor He Mingxiu said that Green Party was just a social movement organization which participated in election. And why? And we know why, because if you read Dr. Ford's book, you will understand, because the Green Party collapsed between 1998 to 2005. However, Dr. Ford's book provides the other way to rethink about the Green Party's contribution to Taiwan's party politics and the civil society after the 2006. And Dr. Ford also arguing in his book that the Green Party is much more than its electoral disappointment. So I cite his work, Green Party members are more interested in getting their message out than actually winning. I find this very interesting, and I think it's a really refresh idea for me. And I also like the way Dr. Ford addressed the history of the Green Party, focusing on people's story rather than to talk about bigger structure and the system. I find that it's quite interesting, and this also demonstrates Dr. Ford's very particular methodology, emphasizing the agency and the opportunity. And I think it's quite important when we talk about a small party. This is always we find how the personal participant in a small party and how they take the opportunity to create their survival. Okay, and now I'm prepared for questions to discuss with Dr. Ford, if I may. And first question, I would like to ask about the issue of the national identity, because when we talk about Taiwan's party politics, I think that Dr. Ford also mentioned this, it's impossible to avoid the issue of national identity. And I think particularly the 2020 election show that this national identity problem behind the Green Party's failure. And this is also one reason why the Green Party loses some voter in 2020. And so somehow I expect Dr. Ford, we had suggested the Green Party to emphasize the national identity issue in the future. However, Dr. Ford reminds us in the conclusion that the national identity could be a sensitive issue for Green Party's supporters. So he said that in the conclusion that the potential Green Party supporters are comfortable with the highlight Taiwanese nationalism. So I'm quite interested to know if Dr. Ford may be able to explain more who are the potential supporters of the Green Party. And is that the emphasizing the national identity and the China relation giving the Green Party more opportunity to win the election? So that's my first question. And my second question is, I'm quite interested about what is Green Party's environmental policy? Have they turned their ideals into concrete public policy? And also, I think this also relate to the other questions. What are the relationship between the Green Party and other Taiwanese environmental organizations? So for example, we know the leading organization, Taiwan Environmental Protection Unit, the 环保联盟, which I'm not quite sure now, but Hitler was a very leading organization for the Taiwanese environmental movement. So I'm not quite sure what is the relationship between Green Party and the 环保联盟. And my next question is about the international connection of the Green Party. I find this part is very, very interesting. I think it's also quite important in Dr. Ford's book. And especially interested in the role of the Linda Aringo on the early development of the party's international relation. So I just wonder if Dr. Ford may be able to tell more about the early international network of the Green Party, and how did this early development link to the later international network? Because I can see there's quite very different agenda and approach of their international network before and later on. And my final question is more about a practical issue. And I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, many diaspora community organizations also face this issue, is the financial support. So how did they get the money? Because we know the election campaign and establish the international network always costs money. And I think Dr. Zhang, you just laughed before. So I think to organize the organization always, how to do the fundraising and who are the major donors for the Green Party and how do they raise the money? I think that's the question I'm really interested in. So that's my 4 questions.
Fantastic. They're really good questions. So, Lena, shall I respond to those briefly before we open up, or do you want to collect more?
Definitely, my question is actually related to Mei-fen's question, so it might help you to sort of frame your answer. My question to follow Mei-fen's question about the connections between Green Party and 环保联盟. I know, like,邱玉斌、邱花妹、陈根正, they are the key players in Green Party, but they don't really run the campaign themselves, and they are not interested in becoming on the front line as a candidate for the party. This is very much related to Mei-fen's question. Why do you think those people who got the ability, who might be able to win for the election, doesn't really want to stand up for the party, but they're highly involved in those parties activities?
Okay, fantastic. Okay, yeah, that's a nice one. It allows me to kind of make that connection. So let me kind of very briefly go through some of Mei-fen's fantastic questions. The first one is on national identity, and it's something that's always been a challenge to the party, particularly in the post-2005 period. So in the early stage, the party has a very clear-cut, basically pro-independence, anti-unification stance. But in the party's kind of second life, the background of party members is a little bit different. If we look, for example, at the party supporter background, it does have both figures that are pro-independence, but also it has those that are willing to work with the KMT and have there are even some that have an open mind on relations with China. So I think that is one of the factors in why the party has tended to take different approaches over time in the way it deals with national identity. So if we look at the party position, basically it's not that different from the DVP's on independence, and at times even it's had kind of basically pro-independence declarations in global Greens conferences. but what is the best strategy? Because I think one of the problems the party has had is that on independence, it often is difficult to compete against the more hardline parties. So, for example, in 1998, a number of small pro-independence parties do appear on the party system, and actually the party struggles to compete with them. Even in 2020, though the DP has a clear kind of anti-PRC stance, sorry, the GPT has a clear anti-PRC stance, it's competing against the new state building party. So I think that the party, I think, has to engage with that topic. It can't really kind of ignore it. But I think when that topic is the most salient issue, I think the party has often struggled. So party figures did talk about Zhou Ziyu in 2016, you know, the case of the K-pop figure who has to apologize. And also in 2020, the Hong Kong protests. In both cases, the salience of this issue seems to have a damaging effect on the party. The second question on what exactly is the GBT's environmental policy? Well, I think the GBT, I mean, that has been environmental protection has been one of the only consistent elements of the party's advocacy over its history, perhaps with a slight exception in a couple of the more recent campaigns. So I think that's been something very, very consistent. In terms of the leadership, the vast majority of the party leaders have had an environmental movement background. And when we're thinking about the post-election, post-2020 election, one of the things that the party has tried to do is to reconnect with those environmental organizations that Mei-fen and Lennon also touched upon in the kind of the third question. But it's difficult once you've broken those ties to kind of rebuild them. And they're all so competitors. So, for example, a key figure in the New Power Party has had a long history in the Taiwan Environmental Protection Union. One of the key anti-nuclear organizations that's run by Cui Shuxin also had very close ties with the Green Party, but I'm not sure if they've been able to rebuild those ties since the election. But I think, again, it's been a constant issue. The party has been created by social movement groups and activists, but there's often a tension between the two, and that comes out, I think, in a lot of the chapters. Now, Lennon mentioned a couple of key figures, Qiu Huamei, Qiu Yibin, Li Genzhen, and why they didn't stand for election. Well, I think that they did become heavily involved in the party organization in that 2013 to 2016 period. And Li Genzhen himself does actually stand for election. Probably, he probably shouldn't have stood. Maybe he would have been better off maybe as a party strategist in that campaign. But I think one of the issues that they have, and particularly if I think about those names that Lennon mentioned, is that they're academics. And when you're an academic, it's very hard to balance the two, your academic life and your social movement life. And a lot of the people that feature in the book are facing that dilemma. I think a lot of them do manage to do amazing stuff in social movements as well as their academic life, but it's a real different balancing act. So people have said to me, okay, I'll come back to the party once I've gained promotion. You have that job security as an academic, but you don't have that as a elected politician. But I think you're right that I think Qiu Yibin would be a fantastic candidate, as would Qiu Huamei.
Well, they both got promoted.
Yeah, that's
they're
right.
both associate professors, so they're secured.
Yeah, they should do, because they're great. They're really good speakers. So one of the things I do mention in the last chapter is that I argue that the party should reach out to these people who have drifted away from the party. Again and again, the party has lost human resources, partly as a result of its inability to deal with disagreements. Okay, let me quickly then move on to the fourth question. I think the difference in international engagement in the early period and the latter period is more to do with the nature of international Green parties. In other words, that the international Green Party networks become much more solid by the early 2000s. So prior to that, there was only really the European Green Party network that was quite well established. But by the early 2000s, we have the global Greens being created, the Asia Pacific Greens being created. And that means that we have a very different kind of, much more institutionalized network of parties, and parties working together. Why it's much more kind of experimental in that early period. But I think that Linda does play an important role in that early period, even though, from what I can understand, she was never paid. She didn't get a salary for what she was doing. But that kind of links in with Mei-fen's final question about funding, which again is something that I think comes up in multiple chapters. That lack of money, and the way that money creates so many arguments. A little bit like us academics, we're often fighting about very short, small amounts of grants and research funds. And I think the party has often struggled to have a institutionalized fundraising system. In the early period, it was very reliant on a couple of big donors. I often found it difficult to get real information on who was the funder. It was often something that was that my respondents weren't giving to me, and I had to respect that. I wanted to do more digging on the funding in 2000, because that was the best funded campaign. But I know that there was definitely some dodgy funding going on. In terms of gaining funding, maybe from figures linked to other political parties. So I hint at that topic, but I don't really have reliable data there. Often the funding came from academics. At times, academics would lend money to the party, and then the party was unable to return that money. So it kind of went from being a loan to a donation. So often we have very messy accounts, and new leadership having to deal with funds. I think in certain periods the party fundraising was better handled. I think in the Li Genzheng era it probably was quite well handled, a little bit more transparent. But I think there's a lot of potential to gain funding from ethical, what we call ethical companies, but it's a matter of whether they can actually achieve that. So very briefly, I think that I've tried to deal with your questions.
Fantastic. Mei-fen, did you have a response before we go for questions all around? You don't have to have a response yet.
I think it's quite good.
Okay.
I really enjoy the book, I have to say. A lot of story, and when I read it, I think, oh, you probably know more. You probably know more story behind the party and the people.
So I think, yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I think that is one of the reasons why this research was just so enjoyable. And almost not wanting to stop, because I originally planned to finish the book for 2016, and then a lot of things came up. So and I also like the fact that you enjoy the human stories, because I really enjoyed putting together those kind of personal profiles of the actors. And I think that also helps to understand what happens later on in the empirical stories, even talking about things like marriage proposals in that section.
Interesting. Sounds fascinating. Okay, we should open it up to questions all around. I have a couple questions, but I see Sophie has her hand up first. So go ahead, please. Yeah, you're up there.
My virtual hand.
You're very quick, so go ahead, please.
Thanks, Craig. And hi, everyone. Lovely to see you again too, Dafydd, even though it's virtually, but you know, so close and yet so far. You speak with such passion about the book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. I've got a couple of questions. Well, I've actually got several questions, but I'm not going to dominate the Q&A. But one of my main questions is, you were talking about having interviewed people over, well, 10 years it is, isn't it, that you've since when you started it. I'm just curious about how those people who you've continued to interview, how their views might have changed, shifted over time, what their reflections might be. Also about the policies and how the Green Party policies might have changed. And in particular, I'm interested in their policies towards Indigenous people. And, you know, given that, you know, land rights, territory disputes around territory is such a major issue at the moment, I'm curious about what their viewpoint is on that.
Great. Okay. Yeah, the two fantastic questions. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed interviewing the same people multiple times over the and that kind of allowed me to sometimes even to look at the same period with quite different perspectives. So if I take one example of Yuanru, the one who first invited me to join the project. So when I first interviewed her, she was just a central executive committee member. The second time I interviewed her, she was party co-convener. And then the third time I interviewed her, she'd switched parties and then was a member of parliament for the DPP. So that meant I had some really interesting perspectives. It was almost like interviewing three different people. And that's, so for me, that was, I mean, it was difficult. I had so much data to deal with. So that was one of the hardest things, trying to put everything together. So I had to put together these huge kind of maps of material. Although actually, strangely enough, the writing was much smoother than when I was writing my my PhD, which was quite painful at times. Now, the other issue you raise is about policy change. And my sense is that to a large extent, the party has been very consistent in its policy positions. What we do see is changes in terms of policy priorities. So we do over time see new issues emerging. For example, in the 2020 election, they were talking about things such as or euthanasia for terminally ill patients. So often they would bring up new topics or focus more on things like young youth unemployment or low wages for young people. A lot of this change in priority would be to do with the leadership structure. So, for example, in 2016, when the party was bringing in more labor figures, we got much more attention to labor rights. So I think that colors the changing priorities. I think the final element, I think, of Sophie's question is, I really love that one. I think when I do go back, hopefully when we go back for the Chinese version, it's something that I really want to push a bit more, particularly reading about the Canadian Green Party and the way that they've tried to push Indigenous issues. I feel it's something that the gives the party real potential to do something quite different. I mean, the party has had a quota for an Indigenous representative for the Central Executive Committee. I'm not sure how long they've had that, but I think that was one way that they've reached out. And they did have a Indigenous candidate in the 2012 election from the island of Lanyu, because there's that connection between nuclear waste storage and the island of Lanyu. And that featured very heavily in the party's campaign in 2012. Sinan did a kind of an island-wide, Taiwan-wide tour talking about nuclear waste, and I think the party was actually very successful on Lanyu. They came second in terms of the party list on Lanyu, partly as a result of that campaign. But as with a lot of the party's history, it's not really built on that. So it's done well and then lost that human resource. In other words, that candidate Sinan didn't stand again for the party. Next time she stands as an independent. So I think the way the party manages its human resources has been problematic. But I think that because other parties have not been sure how to deal with the Indigenous land disputes, the protests, I think that will be a great opportunity. And again, it will be a way of connecting with Indigenous communities, but also connecting internationally. So I think this is something that I will definitely talk about more in the Chinese version, I hope. The kind of last response to Sophie's question is that at times I don't think the party's handled that Indigenous issue as well as it should have. And I think on page 1 of the book, I talk about how an Indigenous politician switches parties on the verge of that 2016 campaign. So at times, some of the party politicians may have used questionable language to deal with that case. And I think that's another place where bridges probably need to be kind of rebuilt.
Thanks, Dafydd. Yeah.
Well, look, why don't we go around and gather about 3 or 4 questions now? Is that okay? And
yeah.
If you could write them down and then answer them all together. And if I could start, I have lots of questions, but I'm just going to stick with one very general question related to what Mei-fen was asking about, because I thought her discussion of the international side of things, the global side of things, is interesting to me, and it's kind of confusing. I don't understand what the Global Greens do. I should. I just voted for the Greens in the Canadian election. They're doing terrible, by the way. It's not a good time for the Greens there. Does the Global Greens have some sort of well, how does their influence work? Like on something like Indigenous issues, do they just coordinate, or do they actually put pressure on certain policies? That might be related to funding as well. So I won't ask any more questions for now. Does anybody else have any questions you'd like to raise now?
I have one more, Craig, but I'll leave it until maybe.
You'll hesitate until somebody else comes forward. No other questions?
I can ask it if you like, but I don't want to dominate.
No, go ahead.
My other question was actually about Chen Shui-bian and his downfall, his fall from grace. I know from being in the arts community, they're great supporters of Chen Shui-bian when he was mayor and then president. But of course, the corruption charges came forward, and a lot of them just, exited the DPP. They didn't want to have anything to do with the DPP. Was there, from that fallout, did the Green Party get a high number of votes in the next election, or did they get more support at least from that fallout from Chen Shui-bian's demise?
Okay, great. And one more question from, sorry, is it Rati or Rati? Please go ahead.
Yes, it's Rati. Thank you. Great. Yeah, David. Actually, my question is like because others already asked about the international engagement. I would like to add one more engagement, which is the transnational engagements. Because Taiwan involved in many of the transnational activism and engagement with the state and the non-state actors itself. And then I'm curious whether the Green Party Taiwan also engage as a political parties or as a social movement, engage with other political parties outside Taiwan. That's the first one. And then whether that's the first engagement or with the other government outside Taiwan itself, and in what issues that they are mostly engaged in a transnational activism, whether it's still similar issue like you said before, or other issue as well. Well, actually, and then the last one is whether they are really care about the migrant workers issues or migrations in Taiwan. That's also another question to add. Thank you.
Good question. Good question. Anybody else? Okay, if not, I'm going to get in one more question as well. So Dafydd, you on your slide, you very briefly said the first LGBTQ candidates were in 2010, and then you said in 2014, Wang Zhongming didn't perform as expected, let's say. But what happened in 2010? I was quite surprised to see that was actually the first time we had openly gay candidates in Taiwan, or did I get that wrong? Was that only for the Green Party, or is that for all of Taiwan? And I see Phyllis has a question as well. Phyllis.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have one very general question. It's more about we can say the achievement of Green parties. I'm curious about what the Green parties in Taiwan actually achieve anything they promoted, because during the campaign, during each election campaign, they try to promote something, some ideas, but I'm more curious about the actual achievement of these parties so that they might be able to attract more supporters. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, Dafydd, we ended up having quite a lot of questions there. I hope you got them all. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, I'm going to try and deal with each of these fairly briefly, but these are fantastic questions. I'll kind of follow the order that I wrote them down on this page here. So let me then start with Sophie's latest question. I think it's a really interesting one, because what we see the DPP's decline. The first scandals 2005, the red shirts 2006, and then the DPP disaster January and March of 2008. So in theory, this is the time when the party is re-entering elections. It should have a lot of opportunity, but overall, and I suppose the other element here is that by this stage in the DPP's first presidency, the environmentalists are very, very anti Chen Shui-bian. They're really, really disappointed and disillusioned with that experience. So much so that one or two of them actually were quite glad to see the DPP fall from power, and actually didn't feel bad about the KMT come into power. Of course, they do change their minds pretty quickly when after Ma Ying-jeou starts in office. But that experience was very, very negative. But if we look at the Green Party's performances, I think they struggle to benefit, partly because the party is just so weak at that stage. They're just kind of rebuilding. And they do try to see if they can work with some DVP defectors in 2008, but again, they weren't able to build up a viable alliance. So overall, I think they weren't able to take advantages, even though I do see it as being a window of opportunity. Okay, let me come back to the next one. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions that engage with this topic of the party's international engagement. Craig was asking about what actually do Global Greens do. I'm not sure if we just think about Global Greens as a kind of an advocacy organization. It's more kind of a chance for the various Green parties in the world to kind of come together and kind of network, come up with resolutions, share experiences. I think it's kind of brings the parties together in ideologically. So the people I've spoken to in the Green Party found it a very, very rewarding experience. It's one of the kind of things that they feel most proud about in their lives. So that experience of being on the international stage, particularly as Taiwan is so isolated. And just to follow up, because there was a link there with Rati's question about that international engagement. So while Global Greens is something that brings all the Green parties of the world together, the Green parties do also have party-to-party international relations and put a lot of stress on that. Particularly, I would say Taiwan is particularly engaged with the Korean and Japanese Greens. I would say that's been the biggest relationship, as well as I think with the Australian and New Zealand Greens. But I think that maybe because of distance, I was so. For example, in the book, I do touch upon a visit in I think it's September 2019, where the party visits the Japanese Greens. And I remember they did have a joint declaration on the Hong Kong protests, for example. So my sense is that a lot of these topics that they'll talk about will be to do with China's threat to Taiwan, to do with environmental issues, but I'm not sure if they've really engaged with that migration topic. I think that is a really good question. And again, I think my sense is that's something that ethically, it's something the party should be doing. Because even though Chinese or overseas spouses, I think, are being given attention by party politics in Taiwan, the migrant workers who don't have the vote haven't been. So that, I think that is the something that morally the party should be engaging with, just as they should be engaging with indigenous issues, even though there's not a huge amount of votes there. Okay, Craig's other question was about, yeah, as far as I'm aware, 2010 was the first time that there were openly gay candidates in any election in Taiwan. As far as I'm aware, there was a Taipei Times article that touches upon 3 candidates that were standing in that 2010 election. Two from the Green Party, and one that was running as an independent, who was basically running for one of these leftist semi-parties that the Green Party had worked with in 2008. But I think it's a really interesting question. I do try and address what went wrong for Wang Zhongming in 2014. I didn't really cite that film, Unfinished Progress, much in the book. I kind of watched it more afterwards. But I think that there's a number of things that he felt went wrong. For example, he felt that he should have worked harder to get more media attention. He had the opportunity, but he didn't really take it up. I think mainstream media attention matters a lot. Funding was another issue because his rivals were just so well funded compared to him. So it was probably one of the best funded Green Party campaigns. Probably in that 2014 campaign, by then being an openly gay candidate wasn't such a big thing anymore as it had been in 2010. In 2010, even though he hadn't focused on gender issues in his campaign, a lot of LGBT, he received a lot of LGBT support that year, but it was less so in 2014. Another thing that mistake I think he made, that he felt he made, was that he didn't reach out for sunflower support. He could have, but he didn't want to. And by the time he realized he wasn't going to win, he reached out to them. But by then it was too late. So quite a lot of Green Party figures of that generation didn't want to ride that sunflower wave that the New Power Party would go on to ride. But that was something that would have probably got them more votes. And the last question from Phyllis, I think addresses one of these big dilemmas that we've got when we're studying a movement party of what is success? How do we measure success? Is success getting elected? Or is success getting your issues on the public agenda? Getting people, if we think about the anti-nuclear topic, making that a salient issue, affecting the positions of mainstream parties, could that count as success? The fact that now even the KMT frames the nuclear energy issue from an environmental perspective, I think that could be seen as a mark of success. The fact that the DVP wants to steal your leading figures, and then maybe your former figures can influence the DVP. Again, that's another way that we could think about success, not always from a party's perspective, but from an issue advocacy perspective. So I think if we interviewed Yuanru, she would say that she's able to change the DVP now, or Fan Yun would probably say the same. From a purely Green Party perspective, that might look like a failure, but from a more positive or optimistic point of view, I think we can definitely see the way that the mainstream parties, particularly the DVP, has shifted towards a more social movement aware political party. I think I've made some attempt to address those questions. Did I miss any?
I don't think so. I think you got it. Thanks very much. Yeah, sorry that we hit you with a lot of questions all at once there. Fantastic. Thanks very much for that. Now, did anybody else have a last question that they wanted to get in? If not, I think you can all join me in thanking Dafydd for coming and joining us in Australia today. So thanks very much for coming. Yes, now we have a nice group here. It's a really small group, but I just looked around and realized we represent Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, most of the major universities in Australia. I don't think anybody is here from Perth, but let me know if I'm wrong.
I'm Perth.
You're Perth. Hey, we got Perth. Great. So we're at least representing, most of the country, most of the major cities in the country. So I think it's great that we're able to come together, and I hope we can keep coming together. So Lennon, do you want to say anything about the events that we've got coming up? Just
Yeah,
really quick.
we're having another book launch, 1 or 2. Maybe we should have one for Craig as well. The next one, we'll have a book launch for Phyllis on her recent book, if I have the title right, Literary Representation of Mainlanders in Taiwan. Is it correct? Yeah. And I just realized that Craig has a book published as well, so we definitely need to run another one for Craig. Otherwise, we will have, as I mentioned, we're supposed to have our Taiwan update and film festival in October due to the COVID, Wuhan virus. We can't really do it, so we postponed it till May next year. So just follow us on Facebook, join our mailing list, or join our membership, so that you keep yourself updated on the events and activities that we were hosting in the future.
Could I just add something, Lennon?
Sure, Sophie.
A little plug. We've got a symposium coming up online, focusing on First Nations art and film from Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand on the 7th to the 9th of October. So I have posted it on the Taiwan Studies. Mei-fen knows all about it, and probably Phyllis a bit too. But I have posted it on the Taiwan Studies Research Network. And Dafydd, I haven't said it to you yet, but I'll send you the details if you're interested, because it's sort of come out of our book a bit too, the Taiwan Indigenous Peoples book. So that's 7th to the 9th of October, free and online. So please join us. There'll be 4 artists, Indigenous artists from Taiwan, and 4 from Australia, well, Brisbane, and 4 from New Zealand. Yeah, and Indigenous films, 3 Indigenous films by 3 Indigenous filmmakers.
Or maybe Phyllis can share it onto our Facebook as well. I don't think I've seen it on.
Okay, no problem. I'll do that.
Thank you, Phyllis.
No problem.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody, and especially thanks, of course, to Mei-fen and to Dafydd for presenting today.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks everybody.
Thank you too, Dafydd. Great to see you. And thanks for everyone, Monash, for hosting it too.
Thanks, Craig, for all the connections and communications.
Okay, great, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, then. See you.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks. Have a good
you.
night. Have a good day.
Good night. Good, yeah.
Yeah,
Bye.
All right. Lennon, you're still here? You still here? You're muted.
Well, I'm here. Yep.
Thanks. Sorry, did I hijack that? I realized I didn't know if you were introducing Dafydd or if I was.
No. I think we did have a good communication. So I actually prepared, and I'm happy for you to do it.
It's okay, as long as it all works out in the end.
Yeah. I think the most important thing is that just need to work it out. I think you are the one who's recording, so I'll probably need your help to either upload it onto the folder or